Joining me now is Michael Shank. He's the Director of Engagement of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. He's also an adjunct professor of sustainable development at New York University. Michael, thanks for joining us. Now,
thanks for having me.
Governments at COP28 are firing off a flurry of new promises for action. What has stood out to you as being the most promising?
Well, right out of the gate this week, we finally operationalized financing for loss and damage so that countries around the world that are most impacted by extreme weather and climate change can get the help they need. Unfortunately, however, rich countries didn't fund it at the level they need to fund it. UAE, to its credit, and Germany, to its credit, put down 100 million, but the US, as an example, my country, only put down 17.5 million for loss and damage to help these countries recover. But the good news is that that loss and damage fund is finally operationalized. So that's good. We just need to fund it at the level which it needs to be, which by 2030, we're looking at damages of 600 billion. And by 2050, we're looking at damages of 1 to 2 trillion. So we need a lot more money. And as your correspondent said, wars get that kind of funding, but climate isn't. And it needs to be funded at the level we fund wars.
So why aren't countries like the US putting more money in when they should?
It's a great question, and this goes to the finger pointing that we see from the West at the UAE for COP28 president's chairmanship of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. There's a lot of criticism for UAE hosting COP28. I have a problem with that criticism because the US is the world's biggest producer of oil. So until we get our renewable ducks in a row and phase out and completely get off fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas, etc. in the United States, we can't point fingers at anyone else, certainly not the UAE for hosting, because if we'd host in the US, you wouldn't see that kind of criticism from the West, though there is that duplicity. So calling out that finger point, I think, is really key.
Now, among the expected pledges are side deals to triple renewable energy capacity and initiatives on methane and coal power, unlike official summit decisions, which must be passed by a consensus among the nearly 200 countries. These sort of side pledges seem to translate quite well into action. Can you just give us an idea about why some of these kind of more voluntary pledges can often, or how they compare to the more formal multilateral agreements?
Formal multilateral agreements are always good. We need them. We need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which 100 cities have signed on to and announced at Dubai at COP28. So we do need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, that multilateral agreement. But these voluntary agreements are good. And in San Francisco at APEC, we saw presidents of China and US come together to talk about tripling renewable energy. This goes back to the finger pointing. As long as we finger point at fossil fuel companies for supplying what there is demand for, honestly, who can blame them? Because as long as there's demand, there will be supply. So we really need to switch the demand to renewables. That's why these voluntary agreements are so good. Renewables, thankfully, are very, very cheap. And so the transition is within reach. We don't actually need to develop into nuclear because we do have the answers available to us. We do have the solutions in the renewable space. As long as we ratchet up that demand, which our cities are doing at the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, then that pivots off the supply and the oil companies will have no more consumers to buy their supply. So we really need to focus on the demand and not simply finger point at the supply.
You mentioned wars previously. Lebanon and both Syria highlighted environmental impact of conflict with Israel. Talk more about war and its impact on climate change.
Not only is war devastating to the environment, but as we look all around the world, the Middle East is no exception here in terms of seeing the impacts of climate change, whether it's drought or heat waves. And so those droughts and heat waves and water scarcity and water insecurity causes more conflict. So unless we're willing to ratchet up the renewables, phase out fossils, we're going to see more of these conflicts, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, because the world is heating up. This year was the hottest year on record. Some of the months were the hottest in 120,000 years. And so we need to cut emissions by 50% by 2030 if we want to slow down these kinds of conflicts that we see from resource scarcity and environmental damage that comes from the heats and droughts that we're seeing with climate change. So these are absolutely interrelated.
All right, we'll leave it there. Michael Shank, thank you so very much for your time.
Thanks, Sally, for having me.